As we continue our discussions on activity-based costing, the first question really is about what is activity-based costing?
Oh, good question, Craig. Activity-based costing, let's contrast that with traditional cost accounting. Traditional cost accounting comes from a pre-computer era, an era where accountants and engineers were trying to do cost calculations using slide rules and mechanical adding machines called comptometers. If you're working with those primitive calculating tools, you realize you don't have the calculating capability to understand the cost of everything. And thus, in those days where the major costs of manufacturing a product would be direct materials and direct labor, if we apply Pareto's law or the 80-20 rule to that situation, it would say that what we should do is focus our efforts on understanding direct labor and direct materials. So traditional cost accounting focuses on those two categories of cost, and then whatever is left over, which accountants call overhead, they would just arbitrarily allocate that based on direct labor. Now, what does that do to you? If you think about it, direct material is a variable cost, direct labor is a variable cost, and if we arbitrarily allocate overhead based on direct labor, that makes overhead a variable cost as well.
Right.
And we know that's a fiction.
Right.
Some overhead costs are variable, many of them are fixed, and many of them are step variable.
Yes.
What is activity-based costing? Activity-based costing is an attempt to look at overhead and understand what causes overhead, just like we would attempt to understand direct labor or direct materials. So what we end up doing in activity-based costing is trying to find blocks or buckets of costs, such as supervisory costs, quality control inspection costs, even costs of things that you do in the office, like invoicing the customer, and then trying to figure out what it costs per invoice or per setup or per inspection, what it costs to do those things. The significance of this is it allows us to differentiate between a easy to produce product or a difficult to produce product, a high volume product and a low volume product.
So we have lots of experience, as you know, John, with this, and we've encountered that really in our kind of business there's some variables that are, you mentioned high volume, low volume, and precision components versus easy components. In terms of areas and blocks of costs of overhead, we know one is launch is a big one. So can you sort of explain how that maybe affects some of the pricing?
Well, product launch is a true fixed cost. It's completely independent of how many units you eventually sell. So let's say, for the sake of example, that you had $20,000 in launch costs. If you were making 2 million parts over the life of the product, the launch cost per item would be very small.
Yes.
However, if the product was very low volume, for example, let's say you only made 20,000 units over the life of the product, then that would mean your launch cost would be $1 per unit, which would be an absolute huge cost.
Right.
So activity-based costing helps us differentiate between high volume products and low volume products.
And sort of one of we've seen the natural occurrences of, as we're bidding against competitors, is that you actually begin to win more high volume jobs. So can you explain why that happens?
Oh, excellent question. If you think about it, if you have a high volume job, you have more units to amortize those launch costs over. So it's natural that when you use activity-based costing, the high volume products are going to have a lower cost than traditional cost accounting. The low volume products are going to have a higher cost than traditional cost accounting. Now, you might wonder, on average, how does your cost differ from traditional cost accounting? In theory, your cost ought to be absolutely the same.
Right.
But in practice, because companies that use activity-based costing eliminate the fudge factors, then companies that use activity-based costing ought to, on average, have a lower average part cost.
And that's been our experience. We've been using it for 10 years now, and what we found is we're winning a higher percentage of high volume, what we call gravy jobs, and I believe we're losing a lot of the low volume dog jobs.
And that's the objective of activity-based costing, to give the dogs to your competitors and keep the gravy for yourself.
That's what we want.